So that hymn that you just sang is an anthem of sorts. It was originally a poem, soon set to music regarding the so-called Bread and Roses strike of 1912. This was a strike that started in the textile mills of Lawrence, Massachusetts, when the workers were informed that their pay was going to be cut. Prior to learning that their pay was going to be cut, the conditions of the mills were such that a Lawrence physician wrote, "A considerable number of the boys and girls die within the first 2 years of beginning work. 36 out of every 100 of all the men and women who work in the mill die before they are 25 years of age." That's a 36% mortality rate, just slightly better odds of survival than playing Russian roulette. Already living in tenements, already unable to provide enough food for their families, already working in conditions that were killing them. When the pay cut came, the workers stopped their looms and walked out of the factories. And the next day they were joined by other mills in Lawrence, and soon 10,000 workers were on strike. So that meant that the mills could no longer make any money for the bank account of the owners, but it also meant that about 50,000 people, if you consider all the dependents, were no longer receiving the support of a paycheck which was used to put food on the table. So at the time, only 10% of these strikers were unionized, but of those, most of them were with the Industrial Workers of the World. So the IWW, also known as the Wobblies, took the organizational lead, and they set up soup kitchens and systems to manage the money that was pouring in from other sympathetic unions and other IWW locals and sympathetic individuals. On the establishment side, local militias were called out, and police attacked parading strikers. One striker was bayoneted to death. In a familiar trick played in the labor wars, the initial union leaders were jailed under dubious evidence. They were accused of conspiring to murder a bystander at one of the strikes. They were freed months later. Now, despite the bloodshed, the strike continued for weeks. However, the food was getting low, and so the effort was looking at its horizon. But to buy more time, it was decided to send the children of the strikers off to live with sympathizers in other cities. So imagine that goodbye. More than 200 children were fostered out before the city officials realized that without children to feed, the strike could go on indefinitely. Their next move, citing child neglect, was to forcibly bar the further exodus of children. They wouldn't let you leave, but they wouldn't pay you enough to live. And if you fought that arrangement, they would rather you starve. And to prove it, the next crowd of children and mothers saying farewell to one another at the train station were beaten with clubs by police to prevent their departure. Attacks of that nature continued. Now, despite the violence, and maybe because of it, the protesters held out. And 3 months later, the mills conceded. They offered raises, time and a quarter for overtime, and no discrimination against those that had struck. The strikers agreed and called off the action, and they returned to work. So that is the story behind the song we just sang. And it's important to understand that without actions such as these taken by thousands upon thousands of Americans, especially between the Civil War and the mid-20th century, America would be a very different place than it is today. Many people gave their lives. And they gave their lives so that others, so that you or your parents could not just survive to line the pockets of the greedy, but actually pursue happiness. To have not only bread, but roses too. The labor movement provided a check against the accumulated power of the robber barons. Essentially, it was an exercise of power against power. And as with any form of institutionalized power, it had the capacity to attract some folks who were simply power hungry, or to corrupt some folks, as power is wont to do, who were originally in it for the right reasons. If not properly construed or constructed, institutionalized power can even corrupt itself. And this does seem to have occurred from time to time with some facets of some of the unions. But in a world where the rules are rigged by the establishment to benefit the establishment, to the point where the lives of the people become a mere struggle for survival without respite, then the power of the people is justifiably harnessed. And if that harness eventually gives us a Jimmy Hoffa, well, that is a bridge to cross when we get there. There are many more heroes than villains in this history. Or you could use this.
Instead of Jimmy Hoffa, I give you Mother Jones, not the magazine, a woman who is an inspiration from her life and work. Called the great-grandmother of all agitators, she taught, a man in prison because he'd stolen a pair of shoes was told, if you had stolen a railroad, they'd make you a U.S. senator. She also said that capitalists sidetracked women into clubs and made ladies of them. A dressmaker, she had lost her husband and 4 children in the typhoid epidemic in Chicago. So she devoted her life to support garment workers, steel workers, railroad workers, miners. Remember the stories of the copper miners in Bisbee, here in Arizona, how they were trapped in boxcars and shipped off to New Mexico. Mother Jones could travel, could testify in Congress, and once led a march of 16,000 children during the Silk Strike of Philadelphia. Even after the age of 90, she crisscrossed the country, Colorado, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, wherever she was called upon to help. It inspires me in my spiritual, political practice to keep going. Can't quit.
And Evelyn didn't quit, although she's retiring for a moment. This union stuff is not just for the history books, right? We find ourselves today in a situation that is beginning to look financially and economically a lot like the America of the so-called Gilded Age. The age where wealth was redistributed into the hands of a very few. But we still have heroes. One of them will stand next to me right now. Organized labor gave us Mother Jones. It gave us Jimmy Hoffa, but it also gave us Evelyn Bennett Alder.
I participated in organizing and a union and negotiating contracts for nurses in New Mexico 30 or more years ago as an employee of the Oni Hospital, run by Roman Catholic Order in Santa Fe. I helped negotiate the contract for RNs and LPNs. Advisors, we had lawyers, union organizers, nurses associations, community volunteers who were experienced with unions. As a threat, we were warned that the mafia would come in. We told them we needed all the help we could get. Okay, wages went up and were awarded evenly to all workers with equal experience. The hardest struggle, can you imagine this, was a demand for 15-minute coffee breaks to be scheduled daily. Fight? What a fight. They found out that 2 breaks per day was the norm for hospital industry. Looking back, that was more easy. The hard part followed the 3rd year at renegotiation of the contract time. That was for health insurance, pension, and wages time. It became necessary to call a strike to even begin to talk. We went out of the only hospital in town very reluctantly, but the community was very supportive, and we felt that it was the right thing to do. Now, that union is still in place as a collective bargaining agent, cherished by the nurses, and embraced by several hospitals in New Mexico where nurses wanted to organize. We achieved what we achieved influenced all of New Mexico and Arizona as well. When I moved to Arizona and took a job at UMC, I found out that they thought I was there to organize a union. But I worked and I was watched very carefully for a year. They told us, we don't do things like that. But I found that wages and working conditions were very similar to what we had negotiated. Influence, it seems, spreads peacefully when it brings about conditions favorable to all. Not all experiences with unions are beneficent as mine was, but good evident throughout the country over the last 100 years. It ended child labor, provided the 40-hour work week, vacations, insurance, pensions, holidays, safety regulations, curse you, OSHA. All this was wrested from the robber barons and credited with creating the war on poverty, the rise of the middle class. Do we have robber barons today? Do we have to renegotiate all that in the workplace again? It seems that the unions in the very states that fought for these conditions are under attack by a coalition of corporate dictatorships and Republican legislatures. Not in open discussion or debate, but in midnight machinations. Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Texas, where employers and workforces respect the needs of human endeavor and market forces, you might assume that no collective bargaining unionization would be necessary. But the earlier struggles can be the reason that we have this peace. It is helpful to have a mechanism for solving problems like discrimination, grievances, disparity of work demands, and changing needs. I value the work of unions, and I thank them for my middle-class lifestyle.
So the basic principles of the labor movement are actually in sympathy with our own Unitarian Universalist principles. And this does not mean that either they or us abide by them at all times. But we do try. And with each there is a founding proposition of inherent dignity of each and every human being and a recognition in the connectivity and underlying unity of financial, social, political, religious, and environmental systems. So there's the dignity and the interconnectivity piece for both of these movements. At their best, both Unitarian Universalism and the labor movement are benevolent methods of power. You see, ultimately, at its most fundamental, the only real political power is in consciousness and consent. The final and fundamental political power is in people. Material resources, wealth, and law are all only vehicles for the communication of political power. And to put it in extreme terms to illustrate the point, what is the power of withholding food from one who is willing to die to make the world better? Consciousness and consent. What is the power of withholding food from thousands who are willing to die to make the world better for their loved ones? That is the bargain many within the labor movement had to make. That is the bargain of the hero. Now, fortunately, as a negotiating chip, that is one that does not need to be played very often. But it is a backbone and also the last resort in a trajectory that locates power in consciousness and consent. That is to say, in personhood. And when persons gather in common cause, when they are tied together with binding purpose, it locates power in people, unbreakable. Tomorrow is Labor Day. So reflect on some of these things as you enjoy your day off. Be with your family and feel the welcome of loved ones. And know that that welcome was paid for in days gone by with the currency of sacrifice and love by a worker and by activists for human dignity and the interconnection of all systems. Welcome that sacrifice into your heart. Be happy, rest, and be ready.